parents, the child goes to the teacher who will guide that child.
What do you mean by external moral authority? You use that expression a lot.
Materialism has to do with when you are
Hello, I bid you a very warm welcome back to the course in Values and Spirituality. We are currently on page 68 of book number 1, where we will be going through two subjects. One is increasing use of violence, and secondly, increasing use of intoxicants. Sister Denise, the author of these books, is kind enough to give us her time and share her meaning of what is contained in this text. Sister Denise, it's great to have you back.
Thank you.
I'm going to share what you've written in the beginning of this paragraph, and I'd like you to elaborate on it for the benefit of the viewer. India has broadcast to the world the message of non-violence. Democracy advocates the ballot and not the bullet, and provides the means to resolve issues through dialogue or discussion. Yet the use of violence in India continues to increase. It pains one even to read this.
It's again this question of two strands. On the one strand, you have the ideal of Gandhi's practice of non-violence and the achievement of revolution through non-violence, but then afterwards it degenerated into actually a massive bloodbath and huge shift of populations, and it was really very, very bad. We have put in place the systems of democracy in India. What is happening is population increase, a lot of difficulty to provide good infrastructure, and so huge amount of stress. And I think violence is definitely a stress response in a society. And so the increased domestic violence is a huge issue in India, because you still have the archaic social values which say to a man that it's okay to take out your frustrations by beating up your wife. Another of the big problems that is connected with this is alcohol use. There was a time when alcohol was completely banned in India, but the loss of tax revenues was so extreme that the only state which continues to ban the use of alcohol is Gujarat. The Gujaratis who want to drink just cross the border, get drunk and go back. But Gujarat is the state of Gandhi, a state where there's predominantly vegetarian food, and yet at the same time as wanting to not have alcohol use, to protect the cow. You know, people say violence against the cow is a really bad thing, but they don't have any problem with female infanticide and female feticide. So you get this sort of multi-level of use of values which are really in conflict with each other. And this only serves to increase the stress that people are under. Recently there's been a lot of infrastructure improvement in India across the country. It's been unequal. There's still plenty of corruption. There's still this increased gap between wealthy and poor, and the use of alcohol has not reduced by any means. It doesn't seem to matter what anyone does. The difficulties, the stresses, the violence, etc. increases. Well, I really don't see that you can resolve it through educating about it. But I think it definitely needs to be talked about. Education is an important component. Discussion in the media is an important component. But again, it's really political will that perhaps can make a difference.
You go on to say, levels of violent crime and communal clashes are rising drastically, exacerbating widespread fear and insecurity. People feel free to behave in this way as the law enforcement agencies are too stressed to deal with the increase in and corruption aggravates the problem. This is a shocking downward spiral, isn't it?
Well, it is, and it's going down very quickly.
You said earlier that once somebody has reached this state, education will not help. What is the answer? If somebody has climbed up the ladder of violence, can they climb down again voluntarily?
I really don't know if they can climb down again voluntarily. When you talk about the laws of karma, as we have been quite a lot, together with the laws of karma, there is the concept of sanskaras. And so when you do some violation, something against your conscience for the first time, it's difficult. Second time, it's easier. Third time, it becomes the new normal. This is what's happening. The sanskaras are shifting, and it is becoming acceptable. One of the things that's been in the media a lot recently is the horrific gang rapes that have been going on against young women, and nobody seems to have found an explanation for it. And every time some horrific thing happens, it's followed by more horrific things, which seems to indicate that when you get shocked by some terrible piece of man's inhumanity to man or to woman, it seems to open up the floodgates for more of it. And it is something that people's imagination isn't able to really cope with. There are some assumptions that if you get shocked by something, it'll go away, but it rather increases. In spirituality, it is said that you respond to violence with peace.
Oh, what does that mean in practical terms?
You know, conventional morality punishes, so you actually use violence against infractions. And from a spiritual angle, if you use violence against infractions, you're going to exacerbate the problem. And so in this case, what you see is the values of morality, which is that they have to be enforced through violence, come in direct opposition with the values of spirituality, which say that you cannot make violence go away using violence. The principle that Gandhi was working with is the idea of non-violence. Non-violent civil disobedience, refusing to move into the use of firearms and so on. But you see, many movements start like this, then they end up in violence, and they either get ruthlessly crushed or they succeed, and then they come into power, but they don't go back to non-violence. They still enforce their position through the use of violence. While non-violence is a nice idea in the political arena, it doesn't seem to have succeeded. So let us look at the individual arena. Okay, domestic violence. If the victims of domestic violence become passive, will that make the violence go away? Well, morality has already told them a long time ago to be passive, and it has only exacerbated the violence. So it doesn't seem to work.
There are some who hold the view that if you have a victim mentality, you will draw or attract an aggressor into your life.
Well, exactly, yeah. I think that's very true.
That's painful to swallow.
Well, a victim mentality is an attribute of weakness. Now, you can also look at spirituality, the principle of non-violence, the act of being in your power and using what we call the power of silence or the power of stillness, which is quite a powerful energy that you generate. It can be quite intimidating for a person. They find it difficult to violate someone who's in their peace and in their power. And we have a number of anecdotes to indicate this. So this perhaps is a very good way to go, but it does require personal spiritual practice and accumulation of personal spiritual power.
You touch upon the answer in the last part of that section, which reads, voluntary self-restraint, education in moral and spiritual values, an example of moral and spiritual rectitude in the leadership are required. When you refer to leadership in this sentence, you're referring to political leadership or anyone else, teachers maybe?
Definitely. You see, in the education system, the leaders are the teachers are the moral authorities, the administrators, and so on. So if you want to create a culture of non-violence and respect for people's rights, that has to be implemented at every level of that institution. And if it is not implemented in any single area, then it weakens the principle, absolutely.
I would now like to go on to the subject of increasing use of intoxicants. You start off with the following words. When Gandhiji thought about what type of country India would be after independence, he dreamed of a land free from intoxicants, but since independence, alcohol has increased. Abuse of alcohol in India has reached 20 to 40% of the population in many areas. In certain rural areas, it reaches 70%.
In the sugarcane industry, at the end of the process of processing the sugarcane to get the sugar, you get left with the dross, the refuse at the end. That is then given to the workers, with which they make alcohol. People will drink as a response to the stress of poverty and a lot of the difficulties associated with poverty, dysfunctional family relationships, and so on. And alcohol increases violence. It causes the person who uses it to be less able to work, to lose their judgment, and so on. And you find not only in India but the world all over that wherever there is poverty, alcohol is introduced into areas of poverty because the people like it, in spite of the fact that it creates extreme damage to the social fabric, and it is addictive, and alcoholism is progressive. So the poor people will have a life expectancy about 40, which is quite low. Health is not good. The body of an Indian is not at all resistant to alcohol. It'll immediately go into the bloodstream, create all kinds of havoc. It's used as a way to keep down the population, but it has a very, very severe consequences. And one of the problems is that there's very little to prevent alcohol coming into the hands of young children. Alcohol in India tends to be used much more by the males because there's a taboo against women using alcohol, although they do to some extent. But domestic violence and alcohol use is absolutely linked. And of course, if the young boys start getting into alcohol, then they no chance that they could get any kind of decent educational qualifications. So it pushes the whole community into a very severe downward spiral. And coming out of it requires a lot of spending of money, and it's difficult because the sellers of alcohol and the people who distribute material that can be made into homemade alcohol, they're like criminal networks, and they make a lot of money from doing that. And to uplift this vast community of impoverished, deprived people who are victimized by all kinds of groups is something that there is not the political will for.
This line certainly caught my attention. Intoxicants produce artificial feelings of pleasure which only temporarily numb the pain of poverty. And poverty is not the only reason. You mentioned just before that the overindulgence of alcohol intoxicants is mainly caused by the stress of poverty in both rural and urban environments, or by peer pressure, particularly among the youth. Other causes include illiteracy, pressure of tests and exam for students, or the erroneous belief that alcohol is good for one's health. It has also far-reaching social consequences, doesn't it? You mentioned that it has the severe consequence that most, if not all, of the money earned by the alcoholic male is spent on cheap liquor, and little money reaches his wife and family. The woman is then obliged to go out as a wage earner for the family with substantially lower pay. It's like an entire web is created.
It is. And the archaic values of Indian society, which are extremely strong in the poor people, say that the woman has no right to leave the situation of domestic violence, and usually she will get killed. That's how it goes.
In spite of social consequences, it is financially expedient for states to generate revenue from the sale and excise of alcohol.
That's the problem. You see, when they tried to ban alcohol, they lost so much revenue that they brought it back, other than Gujarat.
It goes on to say, it is cheaper for the law enforcement authorities to turn a blind eye to illegal liquor distributors than to enforce the law.
That's right.
If somebody's listening to you right now who finds themselves in this position, or who is being subjected to abuse as a result of alcohol use and or abuse in a domestic environment, what does he or she stand to do?
In India, it's much more difficult than in other places because of the social taboos that don't allow the woman to leave the situation. So there's no shelters, or very little. Social attitudes are that the woman should endure it, so she endures it until she's battered beyond recognition and dies. And then the children are orphans, and they get picked up into that spiral, because when you grow up in a dysfunctional family, then when you create your own family, then you bring all of that dysfunctionality into it. You're probably drawn to another dysfunctional person, and then it becomes double dysfunctional. And this is what is faced in communities like this. But it's not limited to poor people. It's right through all of the levels of society, because alcohol is cool, it's fashionable, there's much glorification of alcohol, and people start using it. Peer pressure is one. When you face some big difficulty, one of the gut reactions is, I have to go and get a drink. The problem is that alcohol, if you look at it as an addiction, it's a disease, it's an aspect of social dysfunctionality, it's a medical problem, legal problem. So you have this sort of underbelly of society which is caught in a very big vicious circle. I think sometimes the film industry is maybe one of the good ways of showing what the situation is, because you have a lot of denial. And so the artists have a very crucial role to play by drawing attention to, look, this is happening.
We started off this segment speaking about Gandhiji and what his vision was for India. Do you think this will ever come to pass?
He gathered a gigantic following, and many people felt that this dream, this vision, could become a reality, rather like Martin Luther King. Yet we find that we're still a long way from female emancipation, from the effect of casteism, from all of the social ills. You see, a social reformist, an idealist, what they're up against is a tremendous energy where there is decline. It's like a gravitational pull. And if you want to raise the condition of society, you have to be stronger than the force of gravity, stronger than the effect of entropy. Who is that strong other than God? You see, so then people in that situation, what do as a gut reaction? They call on God, do something. But God is very unknown, and I think, though, that in this day and age, God is much more active, and that that energy of the divine is coming into the situation.
What do you mean by the word active?
Contained within the divine, or the being of God, is a tremendous force. And God is known as a purifying force. And all of these problems that we're looking at can collectively be, in moral terminology, considered as impurity. In the parlance of morality, people are thought, and again using the philosophy of karma, the sort of message that people get is, well, if you're poor and destitute and miserable, you deserve it, because you must have done the karma to create that, you see. So in that case, the knowledge of the philosophy of karma is used as an excuse to not do anything about it, because everybody's just getting their just desserts, so we wouldn't want to interfere with that. It's a cop-out, of course. But in answer to your question, you know, the energy of God is a spiritual energy. And what causes people to get into these terrible situations is lack of spiritual power. So when a person learns how to draw spiritual power into themselves, if you're an addict, for example, you do not have the power to resist your addiction. But if you draw spiritual power into yourself, it changes the situation, and you do have the power. And so this is why in addiction recovery, one of the main ingredients is meditation and addressing yourself to the being of God in order to take power, so that you can say no to that which is bad for you, and that you can control your emotions, so that instead of getting violent because your passions have been aroused, you have the power, the internal power, to subdue your passions and endure the situation and perform the right action. And this is perhaps the only way that you can turn this situation around.
Well, thank you for that, Sister Denise. That was very powerful indeed. And thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again soon for the next episode. Take care and goodbye.